All right, so Victor Wembanyama made his playoff debut by basically having the most points scored in a playoff debut by a San Antonio Spurs player within their organization. Wemby goes off for 35 points in this game, 5 rebounds, 2 blocks. Also, to help, and then of course we know all those times that they basically they're contesting shots that weren't blocked, or just all those derailed drives that he basically brings out there on the defensive end of the floor. This was the first time, as I had mentioned in the prep coming up to this series, that the Blazers had seen the 2026 version of Victor Wembanyama, because they had not seen him in the prior three regular season matchups. There was different ways that the Blazers, you can tell they were kind of figuring out what kind of matchups they wanted on Victor. So it was a little surprising to see them from the get-go in the first quarter. Instead of going big for big with Klingon on him, they actually went with Tamani Kamara, and then Donovan Klingon was actually guarding Stephon Castle to begin the game. But then as the game went along, and obviously, Victor ended up with 14 paint points. So he was basically able to live inside. He was also a threat from outside with 15 points from the 3-point line, went 5 of 6 from deep. There was just different ways that the Blazers were trying to guard him. Again, they had early on Kamara. There was segments where they had the bigs try to guard him, either Donovan Klingon or Robert Williams III. They just use different kind of looks against him. Now, obviously, this is going to be something they are going to have to make an adjustment on, is figuring out what kind of defense they want on Victor. There was also a lot of small ball play for the Blazers with Jeremy Grant guarding Victor as well. But I mean, at the end of the day, they just really didn't have an answer for him. Like I said, he did what he needed to do, got into the paint, scored 14 paint points, 10 of those points from dunk layup range. The Spurs really, took advantage of when the Blazers where the bigs were playing a little bit too far up top, and the Spurs actually completed 7 alley-oops in this game. 3 of those alley-oop completions were by Victor. The other 3 were by Luke Cornett, and then even Stephon Castle got an alley-oop completion. And then the defensive boards weren't there, but that's a lot of it. I think from my perspective, it was that the guards for the Spurs were rebounding well, De'Aaron Fox and Steph Castle, and then also a lot of the defensive rebounds were missed 3-pointers for the Blazers. So maybe those balls were going more so out to the perimeter. So that's why Wemby only got 5 rebounds in the game. But overall, though, he had himself an all-star level night with, again, a playoff debut of 35 points. The Blazers are the ones now who have to figure out what they want to do to try to stop him in game 2 on Tuesday, or limit him a little bit less than what he did in this game. Also for the Spurs, De'Aaron Fox had a pretty good game with 17 points, ends up with 10 points in the paint. And that's, again, something notable. That's when you can tell that Fox has been a lot more aggressive, is when he's getting those double-digit paint points. He also went 2 of 5 from 3-point land. Also, like I said, hit the boards with 5 rebounds and really moving the ball well. 8 assists to 0 turnovers in this one. Saw different matchups for early on when Kamara was on Victor. It was Drew Holiday on Fox. Then, he saw some Scoot Henderson on him, Shaedon Sharpe at times, just different defenders from the Blazers as well on De'Aaron Fox. But the big change for them was the fact that they didn't have Kamara on him as much as they did throughout the regular season series, since they wanted Kamara to be on Victor. There was also some plays on defense where Fox had, switch. They were doing a lot of switching up top, the Spurs showing different bodies at Denny Avdia. And so there was some plays where he had to guard Denny himself, or, guard Drew Holiday, guard some of the perimeter players from Portland, Scoot Henderson. Stephon Castle makes his, postseason debut in only his second year, ends up with 17 points, 7 rebounds, 7 assists. Also did have 3 turnovers, though, had a little bit of trouble there. So again, for him, it was a bit of an adjustment, because obviously this was something I wrote about in my series preview. I was wondering how Portland would guard him and whether or not they would leave him open from 3. And sure enough, they did just that. They basically did what some teams have done this season, where they put the big on Castle. They had either Klingon guarding him and basically standing at the free throw line and just letting Castle shoot, or, him having to operate and find his actions in different places. And then also whenever Robert Williams came in the game, he would also guard Castle as well, and again, leaving him a lot of space. However, you have to give Castle credit. He started to find his way. I want to say it was either in the second quarter or third quarter where he started to get going downhill, being very physical on his drives, and got himself to the free throw line multiple times, where he ends up with a game high 8 made free throws. It was in the third quarter. Okay, I just went back and looked at my notes. So yeah, Castle found a way to kind of insert himself into this game. Plus, you have to give him credit for when he got downhill. He was, of course, one of those players as well who was able to find Wemby and what's his name? Luke Cornett for alley-oop dunks. And of course, defensively, he was early on the primary defender on Denny Avdia, but throughout the game, the Spurs did kind of switch that matchup at different times just to allow Castle to, not make sure that he did get in foul trouble. And plus, they just wanted to show Denny different defenders, different looks. They were ready to switch up top. So he spent some time as well, like on Drew Holiday, on Scoot Henderson, and, really had some good lockdown plays at different times on defense and didn't get himself into too much foul trouble with only 3 personal fouls, considering who he had at guard out there on the floor. Devin Vassell ends up with 15 points on the night for San Antonio. Had some big plays. I think it was in the second or third quarter where he came up defensively. I mean, he helped with the contest at the rim on Donovan Clingan. Then he also got the Spurs going with his outside shooting, where he made 4 3-pointers on the night. Behind Victor, he was the second player who had the most threes for the Spurs. So Devin Vassell makes his debut in the playoffs, and again had a good night shooting the ball, as well as you have to give him some credit because there was different times when he was ready to switch on to Denny, and that was something that he had done during the regular season, was guard Denny. So he was definitely ready to do that. So, and then I guess another player we would say from the bench for the Spurs was Luke Cornett. Had a really good game, 10 points off the bench, 6 rebounds, hitting the offensive glass, and of course being a lob threat on those rolls. And either Fox or Stephon Castle found him several times for some alley-oop finishes. For the Blazers, their guy was Denny Avdia, 30 points on the night. One thing you have to give the Spurs credit, again, Castle, Devin, Julian Champagny, Harrison Barnes, Carter Bryant, all the different players that guarded him throughout the game, was that they really did a great job of not really letting him get to the free throw line, which is one of those places where he gets a lot of his points, where he did finish with 4 made free throws, but again, not as many as he was, averaging per game. And then, he still got his points, like I see here at 14 points, from dunk layup range, but a lot of those were contested looks. I'm going to go ahead and just quickly, just look at his what do you call it? His box score, because I want to see what some of his shooting percentages were. So let's go look at Denny Avdia's shooting percentages in this game. What was he? Because I see that he scored a lot, but I don't remember the exact numbers. So Denny goes off for 12 of 21. So again, missed 9 shots, kind of okay. His 3 ball is one of those things that can be concerning. I mean, he made some contested ones over the Spurs defenders, some pull-ups, and you just kind of have to live with that, because for the season, he's about 30, I think he's like 32% from the floor from 3. But in this game, he did go 2 of 5. But again, if you're contesting those shots, you just basically live with those shots. So he was basically the Blazers offense for a big segments of this game. Scoot Henderson had a pretty good game, for his playoff debut as well. 18 points, very efficient shooting, 7-11 from the floor. One thing I mentioned with Colin Reed in our last podcast, and this is something I wrote about in the season preview, is that for the Blazers, that mid-range shot and those paint mid-rangers are going to be there for them if that's the shot they want to settle for. Now, during the regular season, the Blazers did not want that shot in their shot diet, but against someone like Victor and then having a backup like Luke Cornett, the rim is going to be very tough to score next to. So that's why Scoot kind of took advantage there with again, 8 points if you combine the mid-range and that floater range together. And again, he had a really good night shooting the ball from that area, 18 points. He also made two threes from the corner. Denny as well kind of got some of his shots to go in from that range as well. But other than that, let me see here. Robert Williams, you have to give him credit. He had some good minutes off the bench for the Blazers. 11 points, 6 rebounds, 3 offensive boards. So he was one of those players who was either like attacking the offensive glass for putbacks or being and he finished both alley-oop finishes for the Blazers, and you actually saw him get more. For me, it seemed like more minutes than Clingan, but actually on the box score it says 22 minutes for Clingan, 17 for Williams. But one thing we saw though is that in the fourth quarter, when the Blazers were trying to make that comeback, they kind of retreated from both bigs. They didn't have either Williams or Clingan on the floor. Instead, they either went small ball with Kamara at the 5 or Jeremy Grant at the 5. So again, they're going to have to figure out their front court situation, because obviously they saw in this first game it wasn't working, and how they were trying to slow down Wemby and the Spurs guards and their shooting from outside for San Antonio. So that's basically some of the key players that stood out in this game for both teams. When we talk about the math game, what ended up happening, it was the Spurs outside shooting. They outscored the Blazers by 15 points from the 3-point line. And again, that's something to watch. Even though the Blazers are a higher volume shooting team than the Spurs, they're not a better accuracy shooting team. They're actually a bottom 10 in accuracy coming into these playoffs. And so we see that the Blazers really had a tough time shooting 26% from the 3-point line. Meanwhile, the Spurs had an excellent game from outside, making 45% of their threes. So, again, the 3-point shooting ended up being the biggest difference in the math game between both teams. Something else that stuck out was that both teams didn't really put each other on the free throw line too much. They're very good defenses, pretty disciplined there. Actually, I'll give Portland some credit because that was one of their flaws when I looked at their numbers, was that they actually do put opponents on the free throw line quite a bit. But in this game, they did a pretty good job. The Spurs only made 16 free throws, and that's lower than their season average. But the Spurs still won the free throw line by 6 points. And as far as the 2-point battle, the Spurs only lost that area by 8 points. But again, that's considering that the Blazers had a lot of mid-rangers go in, and the Spurs were kind of willing to live with those mid-rangers in this game. So what I did was, after going through a lot of the numbers, I took away some of the Spurs and Blazers. I mean, not the Spurs, just the Spurs offensive and defensive numbers from this one game in the playoffs compared to their usual season averages, and I split them into pluses and minuses. What really stuck out positively, what was a negative defensively. So one of the areas we see that was a positive for the Spurs, of course, like I mentioned, was their outside shooting. Their volume wasn't very high, 33 attempts, but they made 45% of their threes. So again, a good night shooting the basketball. You give a lot of credit there to Wemby and Vassell for the multiple makes. Also, this was something that was concerning for the Blazers coming into this series, was Portland allowed a lot of transition points to the opposing team. Sure enough, the Spurs got 20 fast break points already in game one, a lot of it due to their stops, creating stops and then getting going on the other end. I want to give Castle a lot of credit there, really pushing the pace. Anytime the Spurs got a stop, whether it was like a steal, a block, a defensive board, he was immediately pushing the pace. So the Spurs were able to attack Portland before they could get set in their half-court defense. So again, fast break scoring was the standout number for the Spurs, 20 fast break points. And then, even though the Blazers do play big with Klingon near the rim and Robert Williams, the Spurs got a lot of shots in the paint. They took 52% of their shots in the paint, which is a little bit more than their season average, which is 48%. So that's a good sign that even though these bigs who play drop defense want to try to protect the paint and take away the rim, the Spurs still got a good chunk of their shot attempts right there at the rim. And, something I talked about with Colin Reed was that, the Blazers will make it tough in certain areas on offense. That's what they're known as. They're known for their defense. The Blazers, they came in with the third best defense post All-Star break. So there was certain areas, that they're going to make it tough on the Spurs. In the paint, the Spurs only finished with 48 points. So I told you about how their percentage of shots are high there, but their finishing there was a little bit tougher, 48 points only. Usually they average 52. Their finishing at the rim or in the paint was pretty tough. Not pretty tough, but a little bit lower than their season average. 55% finishing there in the paint. Normally it's 60%. Like I already mentioned, they didn't get to the free throw line as often as they normally do. And then there was the assists were, of course, down a little bit with the offensive numbers down. The turnovers are something to watch for the Spurs. They only had 14 turnovers, which is just one more than their season average of 13. But that is something the Blazers are good at on defense, is forcing you into turnovers. So we'll see how much the Spurs can improve on that number of 14 in game two. And then, of course, the overall scoring, the Spurs only scored 111 points, and they typically score 120 on the night. But one of the big reasons why the Spurs were able to win this game, of course, was their defense. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I picked the Spurs into sweep in this series, is because I just did not believe in that Portland offense, that they could score enough points against the Spurs defense. On top of the Spurs adding Victor Wembanyama now to the series. So, like I mentioned, defensively, the 3-point deficit was huge for the Blazers, where, like I said, they only made 10 threes in the game. They only shot 26% from outside. Again, they're a bottom 10 shooting team in terms of accuracy coming into the series. The Spurs held the Blazers below 30 points in all 4 quarters. And that is something notable because the Spurs during the regular season only held teams below 2.5 quarters, or 2.5 quarters, 30 or below. And this just happened on January 3rd without Wemby, not January 3rd, April, that last game in April, whenever the Spurs and Blazers played, Wemby didn't even play in that game. But guess what? The Spurs held the Blazers below 30 in that game alone in every quarter. And now here we are in game one of the playoffs, and Wemby's now present, and the Spurs again do that same thing where the Blazers cannot even get a 30-point quarter on this Spurs defense. The Spurs held the Blazers to 2 quarters of 25 or less. That's more than their usual season average for the Spurs. And then, like I said, some other areas that stood out is that the Blazers had a tough time scoring in the paint, just 42 paint points. They only had 51% paint accuracy, which is pretty low. So again, that's very impactful. The Spurs contesting their shots at the rim. They only got 10 free throws, 10 made free throws. Again, Denny made 4 of them, but again, not his usual season average. The Blazers didn't even score 100 points. They only ended up with 98 points on the night. And during the regular season, I think the Spurs went 11-0 or 12-0 when they held an opponent below 100. So here we are, game 1 into the playoffs. They're already holding somebody below 100 points. The Blazers didn't get out in transition. That's something they didn't really do either in the regular season. So they only had 11 fast break points. So those easy buckets aren't there for them. And then this is a real big one, because this is one I had a question about for the Spurs and the Blazers, is who was going to win that battle on the offensive glass? Was it going to be the Blazers hurting the Spurs there, or was it going to be the Spurs being able to stop them from doing that? Because the Blazers were top 5 entering this game this season in both offensive rebounding percentage and second chance point scoring. Well, this battle in game 1 goes to the Spurs. The Spurs only allowed 8 offensive rebounds to Portland, and the Blazers scored just 13 second chance points, which is those are both excellent numbers for the Spurs defense. Again, the only players I saw that really hurt the Spurs in the glass was Robert Williams for a little bit. I think he had 3 offensive boards, and then I think it was Drew Holiday had 2 offensive boards. But other than that, a lot of the other players for the Blazers didn't really hurt the Spurs there on the offensive glass, and that was kind of a worrisome area to watch for the Spurs there. Yeah, I'm just looking at the numbers. So it was Williams 3 offensive boards, 2 for Drew Holiday, 1 for Denny, and 1 for Tamani. And look at that. Donovan Clingan, just 1 offensive board. And he was a player that really hurt the Spurs in their January matchup with the Blazers. So again, if the Spurs can kind of replicate this and keep the Blazers off the offensive glass, it's going to be a really good sign for their defense. The only areas where I noticed some areas of concern for the Spurs, but again, this is more so a product of how they're going to guard the Blazers, is I had mentioned to Colin Reed in our last podcast that for the Blazers, the mid-range and the paint mid-range are going to be open for them if they want to get points from there. And sure enough, that's what they did. They had 16 mid-range points, which is a lot that the Spurs usually give up. But I think if you're the Spurs, you'll live with that. And then they had an incredible night shooting from the mid-range. I had talked about how the Blazers came in this season shooting, they were a bottom 10 team in mid-range accuracy. Well, on this first night of the series, they ended up shooting 67% from mid-range. So again, I think that's one of those it's going to probably regress to the mean for the Portland. So I don't expect that they're going to have another night shooting 67% from mid-range. But like I said, I think that those mid-range shots will be there for them, because that's probably the only decent shot they can get against the Spurs defense. I was a little surprised that the Blazers took care of the ball, because they were actually one of the worst teams in taking care of the ball this season entering the series. They actually only finished with 11 turnovers. So I'm wondering now if that number is going to increase with the Spurs, if they can amp up their pressure a little bit more in game 2. And that, of course, since the Blazers didn't turn over the ball as much, they ended up getting 15 points off turnovers. The Spurs did, and that's a little bit lower than what they're used to. But again, I'm kind of going to watch that for the Blazers and the Spurs. Some other notes I took was extra possessions was a tie. So when you combine offensive rebounds with turnovers, the Blazers got 22 extra possessions. The Spurs got 22. So that's a good sign for the Spurs that they didn't drop that number to the Blazers. And then just some of my final notes. One thing I wanted to note about Wemby's defense, he started off guarding Clingan early on. Then later in the game, the Spurs started to go to what I thought they would do, which is basically let him go on to anyone in the corner. Robert Williams was usually standing in the corner, and Wemby's like, go ahead and shoot threes all you want. So Williams only made 1 3 out of the few that he took. And then same thing for a lot of those quarter shooters. Whenever the weak side player would shift over to the corner, Victor would communicate with his teammates that he would pick up that weak side shooter in the corner. That way he can basically patrol the paint and stay there wreaking havoc and, derailing drives. And so the Spurs were willing to live with some of those those corner threes from the Blazers, and I think that's a strategy they're going to continue to implement heading into game 2. So again, the Spurs open up their playoff journey with a win by 13 points, a comfortable win over the Blazers. Game 2 will tip off on Tuesday in San Antonio.